Well, welcome to our journey through the Gospel of Matthew. And we're going to be in Matthew chapter 17 here. In just a moment, you can be turning there, Matthew chapter 17. I want to also give a big shout out to Josh Brake at the Vista Ridge campus, Hunter Wheatcraft at the Farmers Branch campus for bringing us a great word last weekend from Matthew chapter 16. Amen. And I had the privilege of hearing both of those words. I went to both campuses last Sunday and was blessed by both of those words. I took a little time off, of course, last weekend. A lot of you know this, that our oldest son, Skylar, got married to the beautiful Ali Sinaceros. We had a fabulous wedding and just a real blast. In fact, I've got to show you my favorite picture from last weekend. If you got my weekly email, you've already seen it. You can see my wife is incredibly torn up about her firstborn being married. She is just really wrecked over it, as you can see. My favorite picture of her, man, from that wedding is out there on the dance floor, a real time of joy. Tara's always described herself as more of a woohoo mom than a boohoo mom. And I kind of like that, you know what I'm saying? We all need some woohoo in our life. Can I get an amen to the woohoo in our life? Amen. You know, just going through the wedding last weekend also reminded me of just all the excitement and nervousness of a wedding day. And it got me to thinking about all the advice that floats out there to grooms and brides about how to cope with the anxiety of their wedding day. I can think of one particular bride who was really, really nervous. She didn't like being in front of people, and she was afraid she would just lock up and be paralyzed in front of everybody. And they're about to walk down the aisle, and her daddy says, "Honey, listen, don't even look to the right or to the left. You just focus on putting one foot in front of the other down that aisle. You keep your eyes on the altar, and you keep your eyes on him, your groom you're walking to. Just think, I'll alter him, I'll alter him." And just think that. Well, she's making her way down the aisle, and everybody's looking at her, and she's just locked straight ahead. And she starts saying out loud, "I'll alter him, I'll alter him, I'll alter him." It must have sounded really funny. Now, that's good advice for making your way down an aisle to get married. It's lousy, though, if you're going to go about marriage that way. Amen? I'll alter him. I'll alter him. Believe it or not, Jesus' very first disciples tried to alter him. And the story you're going to be soaking in with me in Matthew 17 occurred after an incredibly awkward and difficult exchange between Jesus and his disciples, which you walked through some of last week in Matthew chapter 16. This exchange happened between Jesus and Peter, but it's likely that Peter was articulating what all the disciples were thinking. It's just that Peter, true to form, has less impulse control. So he just says what they're thinking. And I'm talking about that moment in Matthew 16 where Jesus, for the first time, really begins to unveil to his disciples, "Hey, fellas, I'm destined to suffer. I'm destined to be rejected by our own religious leaders, and I'm destined to be killed in Jerusalem and later raised to life." I don't even think the disciples heard the last part about being raised to life because they were stuck on, wait a second, you're going to suffer, be rejected, and be killed. That wasn't anywhere in their job description for the Messiah. That was so far out of their realm of expectation. His destination isn't to be a cross in Jerusalem, it's a throne. At least that's what they thought. Then Matthew writes this. Peter took him aside. This is Matthew 16. Peter takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And so Jesus then goes on to make clear that, hey, anybody who follows me needs to be prepared to deny themselves and take up a cross. Not only am I headed to suffer, but anybody who's coming behind me needs to prepare to deny themselves. This was an unbelievable exchange. It was filled with tension because it was not what Peter and the disciples were expecting. Peter rebukes Jesus. Jesus says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." And it's here you really begin to see for the very first time that there was a big difference between the kind of Messiah the disciples wanted and the kind of Messiah Jesus is. Jesus had more than met their expectations when it comes to his power. Their problem was this, that when it came to his direction and job description, it was far different from what they had expected. It must have rocked their world. It probably even made them question, is this guy really who we thought he was? Because all of a sudden he's talking like a maniac. Which now brings you to this story today, Matthew 17. 6 days after that difficult exchange, I want you to think about a time when you had an awkward, difficult conversation with somebody you love. Got your spouse in mind? No, I'm just joking. But all of us have had this experience where you had an awkward, difficult conversation with somebody that you're close to, and then you had that experience afterwards of awkward silence, right? Where you don't know how to move forward. I think this is where the disciples are when you go into this story here. Matthew 17, verse 1. After 6 days, 6 days after that conversation, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. This is the epitome of a mountaintop spiritual experience. For Jesus, for the disciples, what does that mean when Matthew writes Jesus was transfigured? The word there for transfigured is the word in the Greek metamorphosis. Morph means to change. He was changed before them. The best way to describe this is think of in terms of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly and the butterfly emerging from the cocoon. That's the image here. Jesus, for a few moments, has shed his earthly glory. He's emerged from this cocoon that everyone saw him in. And he's seen for a few moments in his heavenly glory. By the way, it's interesting. This word also captures what will happen to all believers in Jesus at the end of time. They'll be transfigured. You'll actually see one another in heavenly glory. So it will be you, but you in a completely different light. Pun intended. Amazing to think about. His face shines like the sun, and his clothes become as white as light. And then of all things, they see Jesus with 2 people, Moses and Elijah. How did they know it was Moses and Elijah? They had their pictures on their iPhones. I don't know how they knew it was Moses and Elijah. What's their significance? Moses died maybe 1,500 years earlier. Elijah almost 1,000 years earlier. And yet here they are, very much alive, in a conversation with Jesus. This is stunning stuff. Moses is the great lawgiver. Elijah, considered the greatest of the prophets of the Old Testament. Jesus is the one who would fulfill the law of the Old Testament that Moses gave perfectly. Jesus is also the one to whom all the prophets, including Elijah, pointed. Jesus is being seen by the disciples in the context of the faith they grew up with. And they're having a conversation. This is freaky. What are they talking about? The gospel writer Luke tells you that Moses and Elijah were visiting with Jesus about the events he was about to endure in Jerusalem. So now think about this. In the previous story that you were in last week, Jesus says, "I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to die." It's mind-blowing to the disciples. Peter takes Jesus aside. "You don't know what you're talking about." And the very next story is Moses and Elijah are seen in a conversation with Jesus about the events in Jerusalem. What does this mean? This must really be part of a divine plan. And the heroes of the Jewish faith are in on it. Jesus' suffering, being rejected, and dying are all part of the plan. Even Moses and Elijah are talking about this. Jesus isn't off his rocker after all. Some of the very disciples that were arguing with Jesus 6 days earlier about differing job descriptions, some of the very same disciples who were trying to alter Jesus are now slack-jawed and speechless at this whole experience of looking up at Jesus who's been transfigured, visiting with Moses and Elijah. But if you know Peter, he's not going to stay speechless forever. So Peter says to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. What's he doing? Some men, when they don't know what to do, they go out into the backyard and they build things. Peter's like, let's build something. Let's mark the moment with a construction project. He's a true Jew. They marked places of sacred experiences and moments so that they could return to those places later in worship. Did that all throughout the Old Testament. Peter says, if you wish. But God himself doesn't wish it. In fact, what God wishes at that moment is that Peter would shut his mouth. While he was still speaking, this is never good when God interrupts you. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him. In essence, God says, Peter, shut your mouth. Listen to him. And it must have been some voice, because the disciples, they fall face down, terrified, so much so that Jesus has to bend over and touch them and tell them not to be afraid. And then it's that last sentence that gets me, verse 8. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Oh man, I see that line. I'm telling you. And that is my prayer for so many people, including myself, that we would see no one except Jesus. Our problem is we see everyone but Jesus today. Man, if there's a line to pray over your family, a line to pray over yourself this week, it's this, that I would truly see no one except Jesus and see everything through Jesus. This line right here, that's the point. In essence, God's saying, Peter and the rest of you, will you be quiet? Will you listen to him? You don't need anybody but Jesus right now. Let him define who he is and what he came to do. Let him define who you are. Let him define what it means to follow him. You don't need a place or another temple to encounter me. You need him. He's the only temple you'll ever need. And you don't need to stay here and build monuments. You need to get moving and get behind him and deny yourself and follow him. This was a surreal moment for the disciples to experience. 6 days earlier, Jesus is speaking in terms that they never thought they'd hear, and they couldn't even accept. It was so far outside the realm of their expectation. And this experience was God's way of saying, he's the one. Be quiet, let him talk. This isn't about him getting in line with your job description. This is about you getting in line with who he is and his job description. It's interesting what happens as you look in your Bibles right after this story. The very next story you read is about Jesus exercising his authority over the demonic by helping a little boy. That's your next story. We won't read through it, but that's your very next story. So Jesus comes off the mountain. A lot of you know this story. He comes down the mountain, and he's got his 3 with him, but the rest of the disciples are down there waiting for him, but he finds those disciples what? In an argument. They're in an argument with religious leaders. The other gospel writers talk about this too. Why? What's going on? Because a daddy brought his boy to those disciples who Jesus had given authority to drive out demons. Remember? And they couldn't help the boy. They didn't drive this demon out. And the religious leaders were probably picking on him. And the father is left here. Jesus comes to the father's aid, delivers the boy. And then right after that story, you read this in Matthew 17, 22 and 23. When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day, he'll be raised to life. Now, Jesus is repeating himself. He's coming back around, and he's revisiting what he was trying to tell them in Matthew chapter 16. Maybe they'll listen this time. The very next line says, and the disciples were filled with grief. Again, I don't think they're hearing the part about being raised from the dead. They're still wrecked at the thought of Jesus suffering and being killed. And they're filled with grief. But at least this time, Peter's not arguing with him. Because he's had this encounter with God, telling him, be quiet and listen to him. So Peter is listening. They are listening. They're not arguing, but man, they don't like what they're hearing, and they're filled with grief. It has to be disorienting to them. Because they've just seen Jesus in all his glory, and then they've seen Jesus exercise his authority over the demonic, and now Jesus is going back to talking about, I'm going to suffer and I'm going to be rejected. And they're like, how is this going to happen? When you have all this glory and you have all this power, why are you talking this way? Why would somebody with this kind of glory and that kind of spiritual authority do something like that? Hold that thought. The very next and last story in the chapter, can you believe we're almost done with the chapter? The very next and last story is the strangest story, I think, in all the Gospels. A lot of people don't know this story. We'll just read it, verse 24. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Yes, he does, he replied. Stop right here. Who are these dudes? These dudes aren't working for the Roman government collecting taxes. These dudes work for the temple. And their job is to go to every Jew in their little district and say, I need 2 drachmas from you. It's your tax to support the work and the priest going on at the temple. Well, the religious leaders had heard Jesus say something earlier in Matthew chapter 12. Do you remember this in Matthew chapter 12 earlier when Jesus said, hey, something greater than the temple is here? And already the rumor's out that Jesus thinks he's greater than the temple. And so some religious leaders are saying, I bet he doesn't pay the temple tax if he thinks he's greater than the temple. And so they go up to him. They say to Peter, does your teacher, doesn't he pay the temple tax? And Peter goes, yeah, as a matter of fact, he does. Let's read on, verse 25. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. In this unbelievable Jesus, it had to be crazy being a friend of Jesus. Because Jesus knows the conversation going on where he's not. And he's going to teach into this moment. So Peter comes in, and Jesus is the first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? Well, from others, Peter answered. Then the children are exempt, Jesus said to him. But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Who wants Jesus' help to pay their taxes here in a few weeks, you know? What a weird story. On one hand, it's an amazing testimony to Jesus' authority. He tells Peter, hey, Peter, go back fishing for a day. Put your line down in the water. First fish you catch, open up the fish's mouth. You're not going to have 2 drachmas. You're just going to have 1 coin, 4 drachma. Jesus is efficient. Use that coin to pay my tax and to pay yours. Stunning stuff. I don't know what's a greater testimony, though, his authority here or his humility. He's greater than the temple, and yet he'll pay the temple tax. Here is the Son of God. He's exempt from paying the temple tax. He's Son of the King. He controls nature so much that wind and waves obey him. He multiplies food. He casts out demons. He heals the sick. He raises the dead. He knows when a fish scarfs down a 4 drachma coin on the floor of the Sea of Galilee and then positions that fish to be the first one caught by a particular fisherman at a particular time. His authority and his particularity is stunning. And yet here he is submitting to a tax. And not just paying a debt that he doesn't really owe, he's paying Peter's tax because he doesn't want to offend anyone. There are so many peculiarities to the story. Here's one of them. This is the only miracle in the Gospels that you're never told this actually happens. Every other miracle tells you the end of the story. This story just ends with Jesus telling Peter this. That's the end of the story. Why? Because by this point, you ought to know. You've heard enough stories to know that when Jesus says it, it's as good as done. There's even no need to finish the story. It's just assumed. It's going to be this way. That's powerful. Here's something else Jesus says that's even more important that I want you to note. Jesus says, the children of the kings of the earth are exempt from paying taxes. But here's what he says is noteworthy. But so that we, you ought to underline we, so that we may not cause offense. Jesus says we. He includes Peter in on this. The children of kings don't pay the taxes. The children are exempt. But so that not I won't cause offense, so that we may not cause offense. Jesus is saying something here. He's saying, hey, Peter, psst, you're a son of God too. You're a son of the king too. So that we may not cause offense. Do you remember the first time someone included you? You ever had somebody with incredible power and authority, when talking about you, suddenly say we? Like we're together? Remember the first time you were really included? Oh, you'll remember it if a good chunk of your life you've always been being excluded. But the first time somebody said we, I included you. But so that we, you and me, the children of the king, may not cause offense. Peter, this same man who doesn't really grasp Jesus and his mission yet, who shoots off his mouth at the Transfiguration, and before the Mount of Transfiguration, takes Jesus aside, rebukes him. And Jesus has to say, get thee behind me, Satan. The same man that Jesus looks in his direction and says, get thee behind me, Satan, the same man also calls Peter a child of the king. If that's not grace, I don't know what is. Why would Jesus do this? Because of where he's headed, to make it possible for Peter and for all of us to be restored children of the king. This is why he's going to suffer. This is why he's going to be willing to be rejected. This is why he's going to die, so that all of us might be included under the banner we when Jesus says it. And in this poignant moment, Jesus, through a miracle, pays the temple tax for himself and for Peter. Jesus pays the price. That's nothing compared to what's coming. Nothing. Because Jesus is ultimately going to pay for Peter's debt and all of our debt on the cross. And what's even more amazing about this story involving the temple tax is that Jesus actually refers to himself as the temple in other parts of the gospel. He's the temple who winds up absorbing the debt for everything so that we might be sons and daughters. He pays the temple tax himself. The temple does. And then you have that little story at the end of Matthew, in Matthew 27, when Jesus dies. Do you remember the curtain in the temple separating the Holy of Holies from everywhere else? It tears in two from, not from bottom to top like a little kid does it, which a little kid couldn't because the curtain's about 18 inches thick. It tears in two from top to bottom as if God does it. As if to say, this debt's paid. The temple the most holy place is open to all. You can come after me and pursue me as deeply as you want through the high priest Jesus. You don't need another priest. You don't need to make another sacrifice because this thing is paid. So what do you make through your journey of Matthew 17? It's here that Jesus speaks more explicitly of his death more and more from this point on. Now that his glory and his authority that you've seen basically over the last 17 chapters of Matthew, now his glory and his authority has their attention. He has some things that he's trying to tell them. And like Peter, James, and John, I simply want to leave you seeing nothing but Jesus right now in this moment, in these last few minutes. I want you to consider three incredible things about Jesus that make us want to give our life to him, that make us want to trust him more, that make us want to bow down and worship him. Three incredible things about Jesus from this chapter. The first is this. In this chapter, you see the glory of Jesus on the cross to come. The mountain of transfiguration is preparing them to appreciate another mount that they're going to see Jesus on before too long, Golgotha. But they will not appreciate this mount or Golgotha until after he's raised from the dead. But I want you to consider just for a moment what's going on the Mount of Transfiguration and put that against the Mount of Crucifixion. On the first mount, Jesus is revealed in all his glory. On the second mount, he's hung and he's covered in shame. On the first mount, his clothes are shining white. On the second mount, he's stripped of his clothes. And soldiers are gambling for him. Souvenirs. On the first mount, he's surrounded by two of the greatest heroes of the Old Testament faith, Moses and Elijah. On the second mount, he's crucified with criminal rebels on either side of him. On the first mount, his face shines like the sun. On the second mount, the brightness of day turns pitch black. It's dark in the middle of the day. On the first mount, God confirms to struggling disciples, this really is my boy. I want you to listen to him. On the second mount, that's what's going to make it possible for all of us to be restored as his sons and his daughters. The same Jesus seen at the Transfiguration in all his glory is the same Jesus that will be hanging on the cross. The Transfiguration, though, reveals to you the glory of the one who's going to hang on the cross. Here's the deal. Historical records, even outside the Bible, can tell you the story of thousands of crucifixions that took place in about a 50-year window around the life and times of Jesus. Thousands of crucifixions took place. Thousands of them. The reason this crucifixion is significant, the reason this crucifixion has eternal ramifications is because of the glory of the one who died the death on this crucifixion. See the glory of Jesus in the cross to come. Not just any old death will do. And not just any old cross will do. See the glory of Jesus in the cross to come. Secondly, I want you to see the faithfulness of Jesus to the cross to come. I want you to see the glory of Jesus on the cross to come, but I want you to see the faithfulness of Jesus to the cross to come. I can't imagine how refreshing it must have been to Jesus after being rebuked by his own disciples and his disciples not buying in to what he's saying. It must have been refreshing for him to go to a mountaintop and just for a few moments be in a meeting with Moses and Elijah after being rebuked by these numbskulls. I say that in all love. It had to have been refreshing to Jesus to shed this earth suit for a few moments, to be back in his heavenly glory. And yet, the next thing you know, he returns down the mountain to face another demon, literally tormenting a child, to face disciples who are still trying to figure things out. And then in the very next story, Jesus goes right back to bringing up his death again. Jesus is so focused on the mission before him, though his own disciples are having trouble with it. Jesus is faithful. Let me tell you what, it's difficult enough to deny yourself. Are we not always trying to talk ourselves out of denying ourselves? I mean, We talk ourselves out of denying ourselves. Jesus not only has to deal with the devil who's trying to talk him out of denying himself back in the temptations, but Jesus also has to deal with his own disciples who are trying to talk him out of denying himself. This is stunning stuff. And yet Jesus is so faithful. He just keeps his eyes on the mission. Even though his own disciples are trying to talk him out of it, he will not be deterred from the mission that he's been sent on. He will not allow them to alter him from laying down his life on the altar. He won't be talked out of it. And aren't you thankful? Aren't you thankful that he didn't let anybody talk him out of it? Whew. The faithfulness of Jesus to the cross to come. And then finally, I want you to see the grace of Jesus to be seen through the cross to come. Jesus would pay it all, but he wouldn't do it with a miracle like he did the temple tax. He would do it with the sacrifice of his very own life. One of my favorite scenes in the movies of all time, I'm going to turn into Ryan Rainey for 2 minutes and talk about a movie. One of my favorite scenes in the movies of all time is that scene from The Last Emperor, where this young boy is anointed as the last emperor of China, and he lives this life of luxury with like 1,000 servants. And you're watching this, and you're like, wouldn't that be incredible to be like 12 years old and be the emperor of China? You know, get whatever you want. Nobody can tell you to do anything. After he's anointed, his little brother is spending some time with him. His brother says, well, now that you're emperor, what happens if you do something wrong? And he said, the emperor says, well, when I do something wrong, someone else pays the price. And to illustrate, he just tips over this priceless vase. And the moment he breaks the vase and it shatters on the ground, one of the adult servants is beaten to within an inch of his life. One of the most incredible things about Jesus is he reverses that ancient pattern. Though the servants do wrong, he, the king, pays the price. Though the servants do wrong, the king suffers and dies. Jesus refuses to exempt himself from the suffering of the cross so that he could one day say we when talking about the children of the king. I want to close by asking you 2 questions. The first is this: do you need to let what he has done alter how you're dealing with the past? A while back, I heard someone mention in passing, they said, I don't think I'll ever stop paying for my sins. Some people are what you would call self-extortionists. You ever had somebody attempt to extort you? To try and get more out of you? Some people are self-extortionists. They're constantly trying to extort more and more payment for their sins from themselves, punishing themselves over and over for past sins, when the truth is, you'll never be able to pay it all. And what a difference it makes when you finally and truly believe and receive that he has paid it all, and you give up the fruitless endeavor of self-extortion. And I would just say, if you need help doing that, I do not want you to leave without visiting with somebody here, including myself, down front in just a moment. We're going to be down here. Because I think there are people that are self-extortionists. They are continuing to whip themselves and trying to extort more and more payment from themselves for their sin, when the truth is you'll never be able to pay for all your sin. But the good news is Jesus has. So you can receive the fact that when he says we, he means me too. And if you're thinking, Chris, I really got that. I believe that. I'm forgiven. I'm not struggling with that. Well, then here's the second question. What is it about your life that you need to allow him to alter? Is there a teaching? Is there an instruction? Is there something that Jesus says that as a disciple you're not yet walking out right now? The passage begins with the metamorphosis of Jesus, but ultimately it leads to the story of our own metamorphosis, and it leads you to ask the question, who's morphing who? Who's changing who here? Who's altering who here? Am I trying to alter Jesus and what he asks to fit more of me and my agenda, conveniently leaving some things out? Or am I allowing him to alter me? Who's morphing who? Who's changing who? See the glory of Jesus on the cross, the faithfulness of Jesus to the cross, the grace of Jesus that you'll see fully on the cross. Peter's and the disciples' journey is our journey. It's the ultimate question. Who's morphing who? Who's altering who? And I'm telling you right now, I so want the life Jesus calls me to far more than the life I think I want. I'm saying that from the core of my heart, and I'm saying it over the parts of my heart that still aren't there. And I pray it's true for you as well. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and take what you have for communion. And I just want to ask you, which touches you the most at this moment? The glory of Jesus, the faithfulness of Jesus, the grace of Jesus? Give him thanks for a moment when you take communion. And I would just ask you, what is it about Jesus out of Matthew chapter 17 that you want to reflect this week? Lord, I thank you for your presence. I bless your name. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for your faithfulness to the cross. Thank you that you, the glorious one, would go to the cross. Thank you for your grace that we see glimpses of here with a strange story, but that we'll see on full display in due time. We bless you for your faithfulness, your glory. We bless you for your grace. Will you continue to alter us into your image? And we all look forward to the day when we shall be transfigured by your grace. Amen.